Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios. It is a beautiful day here in the last free state in America, Florida, the 12th of May, 2023. I am joined in the studio again by my friend and colleague from Sweden, Michael Diamond, who is an urbanist and a traditional architecture advocate. Michael, thank you so much for coming back on the show. How are you?
I'm very fine, and thank you very much for being able to express myself again. It's been I think, was it a year ago that we made the
It could
last?
be a year. Time flies when you're talking about the reconstitution of a Western architectural aesthetic.
Yeah. There's so much happening during this year, in all senses, not of course only in the field of architecture and the advocacy that I do, but in all kinds of oppression, different, realms of society. But
Yep.
but one thing that I really want to bring up now, that's like a more realization after our last conversation, is what a messy situation American urbanism is in. And I say this because, and this may be laughable for majority of Americans, but it shouldn't be in a way, because of all your pronoun people. Because the longer you are on Twitter, of course, you're exposed to these pronoun people.
Well, Twitter is a cesspool of madness and leftist stupidity,
Yeah,
despite
yeah.
Elon's best attempts to fix it gradually. So connect for me, and if you will, the problem of American urbanism and architecture with this bizarre fetish for being multiple pronouns in society.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, the current state of American urbanism, as my opinion from an outsider, is it's between a rock and a hard place.
Hmm.
I'm not against cars, first of all. I just want to create a city environment where they are less needed. Not forbidden, less needed. That's my fault. So on one hand, you have extreme car culture. I say this as someone, I'm not, some green environmentalist or something, but it could be nicer to be able to walk to some places and have your kids be able to walk to some places or take a bike or something, not riding car all the time. On the other hand, you have your urban cores that politically dominated, not by Democrats, I would say, but by these insane people that just insane policies,
Right.
because the activists are always, more, they are, of course, it's in the name, in the word, they are more active. So they turn out more, for local elections, they turn out more for local advocacy, they turn out more, in general. So
Right.
it seems that they have hijacked much of the discourse about, about cities. And that's why we see these strange homeless camps that you have in certain American cities. It's not a problem of homelessness. It's a problem of, bad policies.
Oh,
And all
of
these
course,
bad,
it's lunacy.
yeah,
You don't see this in well-run Republican-based cities. This madness,
no,
tent cities running up and down what
no.
used to be lovely areas. It's completely crazy.
Yeah, but this is just one, and then you have, the certain in certain areas, in certain at least your big cities, the crime wave, shoplifting waves, this total lack of rule of law, and now when the consequences are reaping, that big food chains and Walmart and such are closing in the downtowns, then
Yes.
people react with like a reaction. Oh, it must be racist. No, but you're looting the store every day. Of course, it has to close. It can't make a profit because of lack of rule of law. So this is the rock and a hard place. On one side, idiots, running the cities. On the other hand, I will not give the other side, a total free pass. A bit too big, maybe it's a generational thing. The car was freedom, and it is freedom very much for many people. I can just tell from my father, he's a baby boomer born in 1943, and I don't think he's ridden mass transit since the 1960s, and he's
Yes.
80 now. Yeah,
Fair enough. Fair enough.
yeah. So for him, the car was freedom. He came, directly from 40s and 50s Swedes, I don't know, it's like the time of the dinosaurs.
Well, I would say it's interesting too, because having just been in Europe, right? The major difference, of course, is the scale of
Yeah,
the US versus Europe, right? I could get on a train and go through 4 countries in 6 hours
exactly.
in Europe. So it's
Mm,
actually very practical. I was, talking to a friend who lives in Zug,
mm,
and the miracle of this of the Swiss commitment to public transport is you can get to the most remote valley with 6 houses.
yes,
May not be a
yes.
train, but there will be a bus that will connect you from the train to that ridiculously
Mm,
tiny,
mm.
conglomerate of 6 houses. And in the United States, that is just logistically
Enormous.
impossible. So
Yeah,
for much of the country, a car is requisite. You
yeah,
cannot get around on public transport.
exactly. We have a similar situation in northern part of Sweden. Of
Hmm.
course, there's public transport. It goes every other hour, and if a bus goes every other hour, only kids will use it. No serious adult will use it then.
Right.
So it's not like some kind of American bashing. It's just you have very different circumstances. This is more, that's why I'm not against cars. It's just on a local level. On a local level, you shouldn't, for every day, you shouldn't be needing, not forbidding, but you should be less of needing it. But for this to happen, if you want this urban renaissance, people moving back to the cities, and I say, middle class suburbia people, they should, there are many, things needed for this. But of course, they will not return to the cities when there's no rule of law. When police is, when you demonize police as, racists that target minorities.
Of course.
If you do that, no sane person would want to become a policeman. You don't, every person aspires for some kind of respect from the community. And if you demonize the police, no one will want to serve as a policeman. So this very, very strange situation that everyone talks about, that, we need, new urbanism and urbanism. On the other hand, the old urbanism that should be strengthened is politically impossible because these people have the grip of power in many of the big cities.
Well, just for now. And I think it's important to remember that only 8% of Americans have a Twitter account, and maybe 10% of them are active. So the screaming lunatics on Twitter, which I've been thrown off of because I made some benign comment about how come we got along just fine with 2 genders for millennia, and suddenly, according to the San Francisco City Council, there are 97 and maybe more.
That's very racist. There should be at least 150 genders.
It should be. I know exactly. How dare you limit the 150 genders to only 97? So I'm glad that you've gleaned a bit of the societal madness that America is going through. But I'm most curious about how you connect that to. Obviously, there are always going to be dynamics about people feeling safe, not feeling safe, living where they live. But architecture is a much longer term prospect, right?
Yeah.
How do you see the current sort of dysfunction in many, frankly, sadly, Democrat-run northern cities, because that's mainly where this insanity is happening?
Yes.
How do you connect that, or do you connect that to the architectural trends that you find so problematic? I think that's the point of view that would be most interesting to listeners.
Yes, very, very much so. Because you're taught, as understood from many other conversations, you're taught to hate yourself. Everything that is Western traditional architecture is colonialism. I never heard anything so stupid, because it's only Western architecture. At the time of the discovery of the Americas, the Ottoman Turks, they had already conquered Constantinople and made it to Istanbul. Right. Does that make all Turkish architecture colonial? And you have, the famous monument in India, Taj Mahal. It was built in the 1660s by the conquering Afghan dynasty. They were not native to India. Right. Does that make that architecture colonial? No, of course not.
Tear it down.
Yeah, tear it down. Yeah. So what you have is a mindset where people, they are ignorant because they are taught by the university professor to hate everything from the past. They are very effective, they don't forbid people to study the past. They make people uninterested in learning and studying the past, because everything in the past is colonialism and slavery. every beautiful thing that you see in Europe was built by slaves. And it's like,
Right.
no, it wasn't. But you know, and then they quote some professor from this and that said you can always find a professor to quote, a stupid professor, you know, at some campus that said this and that. So they are taught self-taught and they're taught ignorance, and this has spread very, very much into the architectural community. Because the architecture community, at least I would say the majority of them, they identify as these avant-garde progressives. So they are very, very, they are not immune to this ideology that sweep, that everything that is traditional architecture is colonial.
Why do you think that is? I mean, architecture in and of itself would seem to be a politically neutral activity.
Yeah.
So what is your impression of why the architectural community kind of skews one way or the other? This would seem to be kind of the ultimate in apolitical art form or engineering.
Yeah, because they are not taught architecture as architecture schools. They are taught everything but architecture, and they are taught very much to focus on all problems in society except architecture. It's almost, they are not good at architecture, not good at making buildings that people like. They have no other skills. Now AI can completely, you know, an AI can create probably a better building than most 99% of architects today. So they are turned to all this activism to get some kind of legitimacy for their own profession. And I think this began, you know, with the mindset of the early modernists, that they were, you know, revolutionaries. They had, you know, this ideology that they should revolutionize society, make a more equal society, make a better society. And they have instilled this in their students. And now when everyone sees, you know, that the old modernists failed totally, still, you know, this ideology of activism is all that they have left.
So quick question for those who don't understand the history of architecture, including me. What period of time would you call those early modernists, those first sort of revolutionary thinkers who really wanted to use architecture to change society? What period of time would you say that was?
There have always been, you know, people who want to improve condition and make it. It's not a bad ambition, you know, to improve the condition of ordinary people. But this modernist activism, I would say, you know, 20s, matured in the 30s. Then we got some into our styles. You have lovely Art Deco that you have plenty of in America. But over here in Europe, we got Bauhaus and functionalism more. The start of the horrendous journey, you know, towards
terrible stuff, awful.
Yeah, terrible stuff, because it rationalizes people, you know, this view that a building is, you know, they don't build homes, they build storage for people. It's a very, you know, technocratic view of the human condition, that a home is just, you know, shelter from the elements. Not that, you know, the home can evoke feelings, that there is, you know, both a spiritual and emotional side of a home. So this technocratic view, you know, took overhand. And then after the war, they had a free hand, because, you know, everyone was delusional. There were so many competing ideologies, and there had been a terrible war. So they succeeded in you know, with great skill, you know, that you just don't need a majority, you just need a certain percentage of determined people. And they hijack the institutions. And much like communists, you know, it can get elected democratically, but then it don't get lose of power.
Then they stop democracy once they get into power. Right.
Exactly. So then afterward, this was bullying, and people that wanted to become classical architects, you know, you are failed and you are questioned all the time by the professors that are teaching you. So you have a self-selection in the university, arch universities now. So only people that like crazy boxes, then they will enter this, and more, because of the failure of modernism, they turn to activists, because they don't have any, you know, all their creativity and passion, they cannot create proper architecture for it, because they have no tools to create proper architecture, and they are not allowed to use tools. They are not allowed to create ornaments or these beautiful, intricate details on the facades. So activism is all that they got.
that is interesting, but here's my question when it comes to
Mm.
that. So I tend to bounce back and forth between qualitative explanations and quantitative means, right? So
Yeah.
if we're talking about the European context,
Mm.
how many architecture schools are there in Europe?
I have no idea, but there are probably 100 times more architecture schools than there was 100 years ago.
Hmm,
What can I say? Of Sweden, there are at least 4 or 5, at least.
right. So
And it's
in
a
those,
country
so
of
just
10
focusing
million.
on those 4 or 5, the phenomenon that you describe, which is getting a monolithic approach
Mm.
to emphasizing maybe social activism
Mm.
over a true deep in-depth study of the various styles of architecture
Yeah.
from the Romans on
Mm.
is what happens in those schools. So your point is, sadly, we European universities are graduating architecture graduates who oddly have spent not a huge amount of time on the actual tools of architecture. Is that right?
Not exact. They are maybe in some countries they are becoming good engineers at least. In Sweden, they are not even engineers.
That's
So
terrifying. Since we walk
yeah,
into these buildings and live in them, I'd like it to be made by a good engineer.
yeah, exactly. So it's good, but here in Sweden it is maybe an extreme case because I remember I was at like the exam. There was a classical architect that did his, exam, not exam program, but his exam show was final project.
Right.
And I went to that exhibition, and he had a wonderful, model of Nobel Palace. The Nobel Prize was supposed to be presented in a building called the Nobel Palace, and the city had a plot for it, and everything was fine. But at the time, they considered the building. The building was supposed to be in very lavish Art Nouveau style, that it was too oriental for Sweden. Everything is relative. It
Right.
was too oriental, and they wanted to more, national romantic, more Vikings and stuff, for the building, to present
Right.
the Nobel Prize. So the architect got angry, and everything ran out in the sand, and we didn't get this fantastic Nobel Prize.
Hmm.
But his exhibition, final exhibition, he completed this palace, so it would be a functional, practical building to build. Beautiful, artwork, thoughts, everything. Then I looked around at the other students, and it was just a joke. They made like models, paper cut models, and put some random buildings on it. It was like a 3-year-old. They
Wow.
really didn't know anything. And to make the difference, from other countries, they are not even engineers.
Right.
So really, really terrifying. But even the one that learn to be engineers, they don't learn, traditional techniques or traditional perspectives of facade division and such, and they are learned to despise it because back then we are better. The view of modernism is that we are better people today than people that lived 100 years ago. The view of people in the traditional community is that we are exactly the same people as we've always been. If you read 2,000-year-old texts by Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, you will see that his problems are the same problems that any HR department face today.
Yes. Yeah.
People are bad. You worry for your family. What should you do with terrible people? How should you?
This next generation of children are stupid. They don't care.
Yeah,
They got no
exactly.
loyalty to the state. They don't want to work hard. They just want to drink all day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty much the same
Yeah.
complaint that every 55-year-old guy has had for the last 3,000 years.
Exactly, and you can find it in the Bible, and you can find it in Buddhistic texts. The human condition. Our technology has progressed, but not our humans are exactly the same humans. But a part of modernist thinking is some kind of linear progress of humanity as well. That we are better humans, and therefore it's not interesting to look what they did 100 years ago because they are inferior somehow in mind. They
Right.
probably have prejudice. They didn't like rainbow flags or something. So
Right.
that's why we can't learn anything from them.
That's a truly interesting perspective, right? It's not just that you're today's modern progressive, which I love. They grab that word, very brilliant linguistic, kind of jujitsu. I'm going to grab the word progressive when I really mean centralizing statist. But I'm going to be progressive. That's one thing to say that humanity is evolving and we're thinking better, whatever that means. But I like your point that it also means that therefore everything in the past must be bad because it was associated with racist morons and colonialists, and therefore nothing they did could be good. And therefore we can't have attractively ornamented buildings, even though when you see them, like I think the Central train station in Delhi, I believe, was built by the British, and it's still a glorious piece of architecture. But the modernists would have to say, no, it's horrible because it was built by people who espoused colonialism.
Yeah, and there was a time where women weren't equal, and you know, they can always find some kind of strange purpose. It's a very, a historical view. In that sense, in 100 years, what will people of them think? That we are not progressive enough, for everything we did was bad. It's preposterous, and it's also very reductive view of history. I know for sure that people 2,000 years ago felt happiness, love, marriage, a lot of positive feelings, and I don't think a majority of people were miserable any time in history, because when it comes
arguably they were happier because they weren't being told every day that they're awful people for living their lives.
And they had a community, they had a purpose of their lives, religion and such. So in many ways, despite in our view, and it's true, of course, in our view, relatively, yes, they had horrible living conditions, but of course, happiness is something relative. They are happy because they didn't know anything else, and they had community. They had community, they had rituals, everything had a meaning in life. In today's, secular society, I would say even people that are religious are affected by secular society very much. Everything is very postmodern, not everything you do is for fun. I wouldn't say for fun, but it's, you have to actively do a thing. You have to actively go to church or synagogue. You have to actively participate. You're not drawn into this society where everything is, taken for granted, or it's religious rituals. In a sense, you had to believe in them. You have to make an active choice to believe in them. They are not, taken just for granted, like the sun goes up or something.
And that religious-centered life used to be exactly that. It was taken for granted.
Yeah. Right. So that gave them, lots of purpose and meaning, and they were, happy lives. Or unhappy lives, but they were not less happy or more happy than people today.
Well, what I find interesting is that I for a range of reasons, I am familiar with and involved with some very religious communities, and I to their lights, I lead a much more secular life than they do. But on the whole, and I know it's a kind of a sweeping statement, most of humanity does a lot better when they're given order and structure and a community that agrees with them, right? So that's why you see the ad hoc, terrible community on social media who join in and canceling and screaming about completely ridiculous microaggressions. But the real communities I see, the religious communities, the last thing they want anywhere near them is a smartphone or a screen or an internet connection. And I know that sometimes they're derided for that, but on the whole, folks that have a sound religious grounding and a strong family life and a sense of real purpose and meaning in their lives appear to me to be pretty damned happy. They don't seem to be missing out on anything because they're not aware of the latest Twitter trend of who they should be offended by.
Exactly, and that's the difference between when I say old religions and the new religions, because people in the West are as religious as they ever were. They just changed towards gods. So climate activism, this is not a discussion about if we affect climate change. It's not that, but climate activism is a religion. It's a doomsday cult, and it makes people give them angst about life. We have all these teenage girls now in Sweden that they have a hotline if you want to talk about your worries about the climate.
Good
It's like,
Lord.
yeah. So it's a cult and a religion, and you have prophets that talk about impending doom every 5 years, and if we don't act, then the world will go under. If we don't
And
sleep.
like every doomsday cult, the new
Mm,
deadline comes and goes, and nothing
yeah,
happens, and they have a whole new story about why it's going to be next month. I think
yeah.
I told you one of my favorite things in all the United States is out in Glacier National Park in Montana.
Mm,
There's a placard that was put in place during the Clinton Gore administration,
mm,
and it's from the visitor center looking up at one of the glaciers on one of the mountains. It's Glacier National Park. There are glaciers there.
mm,
And the reason the park warden keeps it is this was printed during the Clinton administration, and
mm,
it said, enjoy this view now, because
mm,
that glacier will be melted and gone by the year 2000.
mm.
Well, still there.
Yeah.
But and of course, every now and again, someone tries to make him take it down. And he said, "Oh, no. The federal government has got limited powers. They own the park. It's partially financed by them, but it's also financed by public fees. And
Mm,
until I'm done with my role in this park, that placard stays there as an
mm,
example of a warning to
mm.
be too definitive about the future when you really don't know." I love it.
Exactly.
It's one of my favorite things in America. That placard sitting there telling me that what I'm looking at actually melted 23 years ago.
Mm. And you will see that it can become a federal crime to question this, that you really see a melted glacier, but you see the whole glacier in front of you. It wouldn't surprise me if thought
Yeah,
police.
it's Orwellian. You're
Yeah,
not allowed to believe what you see because the state said it melted 23 years ago.
yeah,
Absolutely.
uh,
There are some people that would love that to be true in this
yeah.
country.
Mm. So when it comes to climate change, it always shifts. If it's a cold summer, it's because of climate change. If it's a warm summer, it's because of climate change. If it rains much, it's because of climate change. If it doesn't rain, it's because of climate change. Uh,
It's too
turns,
hot, it's climate change. It's too cold,
yeah,
it's climate change.
yeah, and it can be justified by everything, and no journalist will ever question it. So now another, US-related subject. We will go back to talk of architecture, but this is interesting. These new gods. You have a lot of migration from Central America. This is not a statement for or against or legal, nothing like that, but they want to tell you that it's because of climate change. And it has
That's
nothing
nuts.
to do. They are climate refugees. No, it's
Not
because,
corrupt dictatorships, crime-ridden societies with no
and
opportunity and lots of danger. No.
and and a population explosion.
And a population explosion.
Yeah, maybe it slows down a little bit, but if you take countries like that, Honduras, I think their population grew 15-fold during the last 100 years. Think if America's population would have grown 15-fold the last 100 years, you would have been more like 1 billion people
Yeah,
or
and we
something.
still have plenty of space. That's the funny part.
Yeah,
People
yeah,
moan about population growth. I'm thinking, have you ever gotten in a plane in New York and flown to LA?
yeah,
You know
yeah,
how the vast majority of stuff you fly over is empty.
yeah. So, but a growing population, it's not a problem in a technologically advanced society. But if you have this, corrupt society, more or less, with all the respect, they didn't, they don't want corrupt politicians, but that's what they have.
That's what they got.
Yeah. So during those circumstances, and the population gets a lot bigger, but technology did not advance, you do agriculture in the same way as you did before, then of course it's not sustainable, and that creates migration, regardless if of the climate whatsoever. So, but that was a side note. But back to architecture again. So these new gods, they are worse than the old gods because they create no meaningful purpose. They create just a death cult. They create no beauty as the old gods created, and they create, of course, no sustainability. It's like an oven that you have to fill with coal because it creates sterility. Now a lot of young people don't want to get children because it's good for the climate not to get children.
Good Lord.
And so you have seen the birth rates in all Western societies really crash after 2015.
Right.
What I believe, of course, is connection to social media, and I would argue that that is, of course, the case. But it's also, I think, that it's enough, with 20% of people believe that, it's good that if I only have one child or 0 children because of the climate. So there you have it. It's a cult of sterility. So a lot of this connects, with the pronoun people. They may be few, they are not many, but of course they are very active in Twitter. And on their bios, they are all city engineers, city planners, architects. So in these professions, in these limited professions, I think they are a substantial part of the profession, these activists. And that's why, and I think they run a lot of the talks and the discourse. And I don't think there's too much resistance against them in these professions. So they can, have an upper hand in all debates about, and then they bring all their stupid talking points like resilience and in community. They always want to create communities, but they cannot create communities. They can only create, interest of hate, people that, want things, not people that, want to build things, only people that want things that the communities create. And their, hatred for everything old. And this hatred spreads, to the upper echelons. I was in Ottawa, had a lecture at the National Capital Commission. Super friendly people. I really like Canadians. Okay, I can't say of all Canada, but people in Ottawa was really, really, really friendly. Very, very lovely. But what modernism has done to the city is really horrific. And then, at a dinner with these people after the lecture, still super nice. But, the sentiments that, our heritage is colonial. It's bad. And this was people of the National Capital Commission. And, this glorifying of the indigenous, population, the Native Americans of Canada, that they lived in perfect harmony and had democracy and everything was perfect.
Except when they were fighting.
Yeah. And it's also very racist. I believe that Native Americans are as human as Europeans. Of course, they fight, they steal, they do bad things, and they do good things. They're human, so everything is with them. But these, of course, this activism that colonialism is bad.
That leads to a huge knock-on effect in terms of the architecture thing. I'd like to switch gears for a second. You made a very fascinating comment earlier about what's going to happen, irrespective of whether Russia or Ukraine wins this current complete destruction of the physical infrastructure in Ukraine. And I think you had a slightly different take on what was going to happen afterwards. I would preface it quickly by, a nod to the climate hysterical church. John Kerry, who used to be our Secretary of State under Barack Obama, and now is some random climate guy who gets to fly around the country, fly around the world in his private jet, paid for by the United States, hectoring people about carbon emissions. An irony, which, if it were a dessert, would be tiramisu with chocolate sauce. But when the war started, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, he made some comment like, "I hope Vladimir Putin is aware of the carbon consequences of his actions." So literally translated, it'd be great if Russian soldiers went on foot to beat women to death in a maternity hospital rather than dropping bombs on them, because the bombs came from a plane which emitted carbon, and then the explosion caused carbon. So if you could murder people with sticks and axes, that'd be great. It's just absolute madness that you would even say, as literally a maternity hospital was being bombed, that your concern is the carbon emissions from this war. They are so out of touch. My brain hurts. But leaving that aside, your thoughts about the potential reconstruction of Ukraine are what?
The reconstruction of Ukraine, we will see when this war ends. Of course, nothing lasts forever. But all the modernist firms, they are very eager, so they offer their support and help Ukraine. Very nice, of course, with this gesture. They are, of course, in it for the contracts, because there will be a lot of contracts. And, it will just be horrible, because you destroyed, already, Central and Eastern Ukraine was very, very much destroyed during the Second World War. A part of it were built in Stalin classicism. It is reasonably beautiful. But then you had this 1960s ugly modernist housing blocks all over. Now
Soviet housing blocks. They have taken horrible, brutal ugliness to a kind of a weird, nasty art form.
Yeah. And people post it on Instagram, and a lot of these pronoun people, oh, but it was housing for people. Like, no, it was storage for people. It was not housing. They were not homes they built. They were storing people so they could ship them to their factories and then ship them home. There's nothing beautiful in this. But they are going, they are after the contracts, and they want to rebuild Ukraine, of course.
Right.
And this is really a danger, because they already had it bad. Should we rebuild Ukraine in total modernist dystopia? Is that what we want, to make the country totally unlivable? It has failed all over the Western Europe and Central Europe. It has failed in the United States and Canada. It has failed everywhere else in the world. Why should we repeat it? This should be a chance to rebuild Ukrainian urbanism in a better fashion, because they have little historic architecture, and of course they want to shake away the Soviet legacy, because it's seen as the Russian legacy. Sure. So they will not rebuild, the Stalin classicist building will probably, the ones destroyed will not be repaired or rebuilt, they will be torn down. So it will be like, tabula rasa of many Ukrainian cities. They will be rebuilt from ground, and you will see this. I'm very afraid you will see the more strange and ugly building after another being rebuilt and giving to all these star architects, because also when governments negotiate, it's much easier to negotiate with big firms that can do a lot of things at the same time.
Of course, yeah, you're not going to go out and spread around to 1,000 architectural firms, for $200,000 commissions each, because that's just a pain in the ass. Yeah. Well, it always seems a little strange to me, but this is just reality, right? Yeah. You're right. There are already firms in Ukraine, rebuilding parts of the electric grid. Like, they're already doing that. So although it seems odd, much like I criticized John Kerry for worrying about carbon emissions while mothers are being bombed in a hospital, it also seems a little odd just to be preoccupied with the relative aesthetic nature of the buildings that will come after the war. But it's true, it will happen. The war will end, whether they run out of bullets, whether they quit, whether they surrender, whatever, it will end. And how does one, here's a good thought experiment, or maybe it's a real world question. How would you go about advocating to, say, the UN or any of the countries, including the US, God knows why, who are ponying up all this money to rebuild Ukraine? Like, where would you start making the argument for, hey, look, we're going to rebuild. Maybe we could do it beautiful. Like, how do you actually start that conversation?
Well, it's, of course, you need political connections. You need political connections. I am partly in contact. I was connected with a former advisor of Zelensky, and I think she was part of Parliament, Ukrainian Parliament. So through that, because they of course want to rebuild now. When rebuilding, they want to make it, a new fresh start, the most modern and most progressive there has ever been, and just tell them the idea that true progressive is to make architecture that people love, that creates real community, that creates passion, that creates love for one city. That is true, progressive thought. Architecture that ordinary people that didn't went to architecture school like, because there's of course a lot of doublethink among the modernists. On one hand, they say that they care about the poor and the needy. On the other hand, they think that people need, what's the word for it? Disruptive architecture. Right. They see some kind of meaning it's really, if you talk about, privilege, that is so fashionable to talk about now, it's really a luxury problem that your life, you live in such a beautiful setting that you need ugly buildings,
That's good.
I don't think, if we talk about the really downtrodden, I don't think a single mother or a poor pensioner really feel the need for disruptive architecture in their communities that will make them question blah 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 blah.
I live in this ugly gray box, but I've been told that it's really, really wonderful because it represents the freedom of the proletariat.
Exactly.
Gosh, I like it a lot.
Yeah. But that's the thinking. That's the thinking. So tell them, what is true progress, and it can only go through political connections, and we're working on that. But of course, I think we will have a small success, but the big success will go to all the big firms, of course.
Okay, but that I like to push on that because so always curious about what are proposed solutions, right? The world is full of things we can moan about, and many of them, like climate religionists, I can't talk to, so who cares? But when it comes down to sort of practicalities, there's actually a policy you can make, right? There is a suggestion you would make to say the people in a given town or city who are going to have to live with the results of reconstruction.
Yes.
It's not that complicated to have them be directly involved in the decision-making process of what's going to get built, right? The money's still going to be spent anyway. So every town or locality or municipality would have, potentially an architectural contest, right? It's not going to cost that much money. Quite frankly, every architect that enters into a contest is doing it to win business anyway. So we're going to rebuild 800 houses and 4,000 apartment blocks, and we're going to have a competition. And the people who are going to live in those buildings get to vote on what it is. I think that is eminently doable. It's possible for a large company to run that process too, right? You're just there to do the construction. So maybe I love this conversation. That sounds to me like an actionable thing that people could push on. Every individual could speak to their representative. Those who are involved in the process directly could clamor for that, and that would end up in a much better process. And it would not be significantly more expensive. It would irritate the big company executives for whom it would just be easier to build 9,000 square boxes, but they're not going to live in them. So let the people have a say.
Yeah, the modernists have learned, from I think it was Henry Ford. You can choose your color of the
any
car,
color as long as it's black, right?
As long as it's black. So what they do when they do architecture competitions, they give you 5 types of modernism. They will not give you, an option between a classical, let's say 4 classical projects and 4 modernist projects. It will all be 5 different types of modernism, which will create about 0 engagement by the public,
right?
And some of this ugly. So it's important to stress to have
the community drives the process. Absolutely. That's the point. Not that you're given 5 equally ugly options. No. The community is going to drive the process. And it's not that much harder than doing it the way they're going to do it anyway, right? It's just going to add a month to the process. You've got local architects who are clamoring for business, and this is their chance to say, here's what I would build. Great. Terrific. It's literally 4 or 5 more weeks than it would be otherwise, and you'll get community buy-in, and you'll get probably a much better result. Some people will choose ugly gray boxes. Good for them, and many will not. But you're absolutely right. You can't let the same kind of architectural criminals run the process, because you'll get the same exact result.
Yeah. And of course, there will be corruption in this, because it's a lot of money involved, and there are a lot of big firms involved. And then, if you don't give money to people, you can wine and dine them and send them to nice trips where you meet up to present your project at a Caribbean island.
I have some good news on that front. When it comes to Ukrainian reconstruction, I have some really good news on that front. I just know some of the guys who are doing some contracting work on the electric grid. And the U.S. government, the money that was granted to Ukraine is not going to Ukraine. It is sitting in American bank accounts. The contractors who are subject to American anti-corruption laws the detail of financials they provide are actually phenomenal. This is one of the great things. I sometimes criticize my government, but I'm going to give them huge credit here for the process so far that I have gotten to see a little bit of. None of that. There is no flying Ukrainian officials to the Caribbean for sushi dinners for a week. No. This is all going to be run. Here's the need. We've looked at the need. We approve the need. Every dollar spent is going towards it. So that can be solved for. Absolutely can be. I can't speak to money coming from other places who might have looser definitions of influence, but I'm encouraged by this chat, Michael. I'm encouraged. I think you've identified a serious problem, but I think there's a serious way that people can get involved to demand that for the part of this that relates to the buildings humans are going to live in and live with, it can be done better than just giving an engineering firm a big check to go build me 40,000 housing units.
Yeah. It can be, it's always, about marketing to politicians to get them involved and get them support. And, as mentioned before, this is the most progressive. If you want to be forward-looking and progressive, we see that the old has failed, the old modernism has failed, all these horrible concrete housing blocks. People don't want to live that. They live there when they have nowhere else to go.
Right.
So instead, build things that people like and show that this is, they build as such. If you want to become, Ukraine has, of course, an aspiration now to become more Western European. Well, we build a lot of this now in Western Europe, in France and UK. So show examples of this, see how successful it is, and then how much people like it, and then implement it as well. It's not the star architects that get people love in Western Europe. It's the traditional architects, and it's the traditional architects that get that love everywhere. It's not the modernist architects. The modernist architects get love from other architects mainly, and of course, young men online that have this view of cities and buildings from like a bird perspective, that don't understand that buildings are experienced, from the street level, not from their drone view. Because of course, from a drone, Dubai can look really, really cool, but then you walk on the ground level, it's just shit, altogether.
Well, I'm not going to provoke the fine people of the UAE with comments on that assertion, but I am going to say, I think we're going to close with the idea that which should not be revolutionary, but is that you should build buildings that people like. Yeah. I think you've encapsulated your activist statement for traditionalist urbanism perfectly there. That ironically is the revolution. Why don't you build things that people want?
And then you question what buildings do people like? We have now, a growing number of studies. Like every year there comes a new, scientific article and a new poll. What people, what kind of, if you will have a building built next to you, not your building, but a building next to you, how you prefer it look like? And they get 4 options. 2 are traditional and 2 are classical. And the result is more or less always the same. 3/4 prefer a new traditional building built next to them, and 1/4 prefers a modernist take. But every time you show these surveys, and there are many, no, but the survey is not, it's not valid, because you have to see the building in front of you. They will make all kinds of excuses,
Sure.
So all this, you cannot, even despite, the proof now, you can't convince these modernists. You can't convince them that, people don't want your crap, because they don't believe, they don't recognize the studies. If they don't do the studies themselves, it's not valid. Every study that's made is not valid in their eyes if it doesn't prove that modernism is superior. And at the moment, no study has ever shown that. So it's a problem. I thought, that things would be settled now that we have so many studies, confirm that people prefer traditional architecture. But they will just,
ideologues never let facts get in the way.
No, it wasn't true socialism, and it wasn't a true study, So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love that. We just haven't done socialism the right way.
Yeah.
Yep. Trust me, they tried.
And many of these people are socialists, by the way. I would argue a lot of these pronoun people are socialists, and for me, it's so mind blowing, because I live in Sweden. I live 1 hour flight. Europe is small. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
1 hour flight from the Baltic republics that used to belong to Soviet Union. And you can see the result of 50 years of Soviet Union. They used to be as wealthy and rich as Sweden. And now they are dirt poor. And, neglect the buildings, immigration. And it's so easy. You can just, for all these Europeans and even Americans, you can go to former Soviet republics and former countries, look for yourself and talk to people.
And it's still a disaster, even decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, they are still poorer than Western Europe. And, it's so many, they have dual problem. They are poor, and of course they're young now because of the European Union. They emigrate, why,
Why stay?
Why stay, shit wage, and then you take an hour flight to Sweden, and then you can earn, twice or thrice as much. You don't, you can, a truck driver in Sweden can probably earn more than many doctors in Eastern Europe. So even still, 30 years after fall of communism.
Still
So
nice.
Everyone can see this, and still, they believe in socialism, and they are all very, very much in urbanism studies and architecture studies. So that's the bad thing, that even if Twitter is small and it's just a tiny percentage that use it, I think these people are very much concentrated in the architecture and urbanist profession. And why I believe that is because I was active, in different Facebook groups about urbanism, and I never ever found anything of value.
No,
really, no. Never ever.
You're pumping a dry well there. So, Michael, we're gonna have to cut this here. We'll come back. We're gonna do a second one, maybe while we're watching the reconstruction of Ukraine. Hopefully, with some of the input that your ideas have provided here. What would you close with? What would you say to people who are kind of thinking about this and you're right, I don't want to live in an ugly city, or I want choices to be made by municipalities when it comes to architectural choice. It's such an abstract thing for most people who are not architects, who are not involved in city planning, but this is their, in a democratic society, this is their place, this is where they live. What would you suggest that those people do to kind of both educate themselves a bit on what the kind of traditionalism that you espouse, and how do they express that to people, to government officials?
Yeah, 99% of people don't have architecture as a main profession or interest, I would say, rather. So they vote with their feet. They try to live in such a nice, beautiful neighbors as they can, as their means, give them option to do. But they don't think so much about them. They are interested in other things in life, and that is good. So simple slacktivism. There are a growing number, even in the US, organizations that advocate for new traditional architecture and urbanism. Just join their social media channels, like and share their content so that you see it and your friends see it. That's all that needs to be done. Liking beautiful new neighborhood, a beautiful new building in your locality, and share it so that everyone always knows that there is an option. Because if people know that there is an option, they will talk about, why can't we build? Oh, I saw that they built like this over there. Why can't we build it here? So you get a change in the conversation.
So like everything else, it's person by person incrementalism, and people either take an interest in improving the lives and the built surroundings, or they don't. So Messy Times is going to endorse Michael's view that you should pay attention to your built environment and try to persuade those in power who have decisions that they should go in directions you like. That would be, I guess, all we can do. And we believe strongly in individual freedom and responsibility here in the Messy Times studios. So I guess that can be the only answer. We're not here to force anyone to do anything. But Michael, thank you so much for taking the time. It has been delightful to speak again. I wish you a phenomenal weekend. And for everyone else out there, thank you for tuning in. I'm reminding you once again to save your brains the pain and turn off the mainstream media and tune in to Messy Times.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers.
Learn what Bitcoin is, how it works, and why it matters. Bitcoin 101, your ultimate guide to the fundamentals of blockchain.